I think the fascination with future technology comes from the way my mindset was as a kid. So when I was growing up, I actually always told my people in my family, like, hey, I want to be a businessman when I grow up. So when I was 8 or 9, I would ask for office supplies for my birthday. Or when I was a teenager, I would say I want to be a CEO. And then eventually, as I got to like 17, I always mention this part because it's always very interesting. As a 17-year-old, the words that came out of my mouth were, I want to be a CEO of an international business driven to innovate technology and ideology.
Podcast Junkies, episode 251. Welcome back. I'm your host, Harry Duran. If you are discovering this show for the first time, then you're in for a treat. It's the one where I seek out interesting voices in podcasting and get them to share their stories about what inspired them to start their shows. And then we see whatever rabbit hole we end up down. And this week is definitely one of those episodes. But first, last week, we had a conversation with Rachel Cook. She's the host of Promote Yourself to CEO. Make sure you check that out if you haven't already, episode 250. So this week's episode, Dustin Miller is the host of the Polymath PolyCast. Dustin shares his background as an entrepreneur and a content creator. And the show is for polymaths, entrepreneurs, multipotentialites, and innovators. That is a mouthful, and you'll understand why in this episode. I'm telling you, we cover a wide variety of topics, from the growing community of polymaths to existential crises, believe it or not. Dustin shares his passion for business and future tech. The intro snippet was a sneak peek as to how his mind works. This episode is brought to you by Focusrite, and specifically the Scarlett 2i2 sound card, one of my favorite go-to sound cards, something I use for each and every podcast recording. The 3G line is a go-to for all new podcasters. Find out more at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite, and the link will be in the show notes as well. One of the first things that's important is for him to explain exactly what a polymath does. So he does that for our audience, and he talks about how he came up with the idea for PolyInnovator. He does geek out a little bit on explaining how he structures the content on his website and on the show, and how he's grown as a host and interviewer, and a recent crisis he experienced. I have him share one of his more fascinating guests. As in, imagine with a podcast like this, he has a lot. Let's not forget that this episode is also brought to you by Fullcast. Fullcast.co is the website. If you need help with any aspect of your show, from launch to production and marketing, we can help. Schedule a free chat at fullcast.co/chat15 about your existing or new show. And I learn about how he is constantly challenging himself to be a better host and a content creator. This is an interesting conversation for myself because I found myself constantly making sure that I was keeping pace with Dustin. I think that was top of mind for me because I can just see the way his mind works, and it was fun to have the visual of the video to engage with him more closely for this interview. If you enjoyed this episode or past episodes, don't forget to leave us a rating and a review at ratethispodcast.com/podcastjunkies. I'll be sure to read them out on future episodes. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's get polymathed with Dustin. So Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, thank you for joining me on Podcast Junkies.
Thank you for having me, Harry.
Where's home for you? I should have probably asked you that earlier, but you can educate my listener as well now too.
Well, I live in the Midwest of the U.S., kind of the heart of it, even the West, too.
Which city?
I live in Columbia, Missouri.
Okay, so I'm in Minneapolis now. So I'm I'm officially a resident of the Midwest, but I grew up in New York. Regular listeners will know that I grew up in Yonkers, New York, just outside New York City. So I lived there most of my life. Did a stint in Atlanta for a couple of years, and then lived previous to Minneapolis in LA. So I've always been like a big city kind of guy. love the hustle and the bustle. And now I've been in Minneapolis for about a year and a half.
That's nice. It's interesting because I want to move to a bigger city, whether that's Austin or Singapore. Those are the two that I'm looking at.
Yeah, my partner and I looked at Austin. We went down a couple of times before moving in here. We have friends there. Shout out to Ever Gonzalez, creator of the Outlier Podcast Festival, who's down there, and really like the vibe there. The startup community is really strong as well. So I think my partner's family's here. She's a photographer here, and that was like the final decision. But it's been interesting because we're planning to go to Florida for a month, in February, and just to kind of get out of the winter. And because we have remote businesses, and almost everyone is forced to be remote, whether they like it or not. It's an interesting time to experiment and try out different places to live.
For sure. Definitely.
Why? I mean, it's a big, maybe it's not as different as it may seem, but Austin and Singapore seem like two completely different cities. So what's the draw for both of those?
Well, I would say that both of them are more like techie based, and so there's a bit of a more futuristic mindset when it goes to it. Like you said, there's a startup scene in Austin. There's actually a blooming startup scene in Singapore as well, and it's one of the most modern cities in the world. Surprisingly, they don't have as much sustainability or renewable energy endeavors that you would think a smart city like that, or smart nation as they call themselves. And so that's just, I want to be around the future, and I thought those two places would be pretty futuristic. Plus, better weather than Missouri.
So we're going to definitely dive deep into your background as an entrepreneur and obviously with the podcast. But, you know, this is the type of show where I just pull threads as they come up. So what's this fascination with future technology? Like, when did that start? And what's the draw for you?
I think the fascination with future technology comes from the way my mindset was as a kid. So when I was growing up, I actually always told my people in my family, like, hey, I want to be a businessman when I grow up. So when I was 8 or 9, I would ask for office supplies for my birthday. Or when I was a teenager, I would say I want to be a CEO. And then eventually, as I got to like 17, I always mention this part because it's always very interesting. As a 17-year-old, the words that came out of my mouth were, I want to be a CEO of an international business driven to innovate technology and ideology.
Wow.
It's like, that's a weird statement to make as a teenager, and that's what I wanted. And I think that started a fascination with smart cities and the futuristic society, and that's why that came to be.
How far back can you remember where this was something that was active in your imagination? Were there people that you were listening to, shows you were watching? Like, were you just like a Elon Musk fanboy from early days, or like, where did it start?
I mean, when it started for entrepreneurship, it was more about, like, even if I wanted to be a businessman when I was younger, it was like when I was 10, I found in 101 ways a teenager can make money. And so I was like, I want to make some more money so I can go buy some Pokemon cards or whatever that may be. And I settled on doing kind of a retail, a commerce business. And so I wanted to sell temporary tattoos of all things. And that's what I did. I even had my own stand on Earth Day festival in town as a kid with these tiny little kid tables and whatnot. And I think that kind of got me in the idea of like, okay, if I want to do something, I can work towards it in some way.
I'm also wondering like what your parents thought. And do you have siblings, and did they have the same interest as well?
So I actually have a decent amount of siblings, but only one of them sort of grew up with me. I have 3 step siblings and about 5 half siblings on my father's side, but I don't know really any of those very well. I only had 1 half sister on my mom's side that I grew up with, and she was born when I was 14. So okay. Big difference there. Yeah. I've been more of an influence to them than relatively the other way around.
I get the sense, and I don't know how much you believe in like past lives, but I feel like you're an old soul because, you know, especially with that aspiration that you mentioned when you were 17. I don't know, and you probably experienced this, I don't know that a lot of your peers were thinking along those same lines as well. Yeah,
I've been told that a lot, actually. So it's interesting you mentioned that too.
So what about the entrepreneurial bug? Like when did that kick in? And you know, you mentioned some early endeavors, but was that something what was inspiring you there? And why is that something that was important for you?
Well, it's been so long that I have a picture in my head of the cover of that book, and I remember skipping through it and seeing what kind of things would resonate, and I just wanted to see what could I do. And I had a fascination with temporary tattoos at the time. I had a surplus even. I knew how to buy them for cheap. You could buy like 25 for $1, so I knew how to get a quantity of them. And so I think that's just kind of, it was a connector mentality. Like I saw different things that could be connected together. And that actually is the same philosophy as my personal brand, Ethos too, where it's about connecting things and taking a polymathic approach.
You know, it's interesting about that term, and I've heard it used a lot. And so for the benefit of the listener, can you define for you what a polymath is?
Yeah, so there's actually a few different kind of ways of explaining it. There's some really great researchers who are trying to define it as well, and I've been learning from them. Personally, I find it as someone who's a multi-specialist, and the traditional textbook definition is someone who has learned many and is interested in many different areas, or learned much, and that means a deep level of knowledge, so almost a specialist level, although there's a few different kind of ways people look at polymaths, whether that is a expert level or just very deep well knowledge, just in many different areas, 3+ areas kind of thing.
When did you hear the term, and when did you realize you were a polymath?
Well, and the funny thing is, I would still say I'm an aspiring polymath because there is this kind of idea of a egotistical thing when it comes to polymathy, like, oh, I'm this great. It's so many different things. It's not really about that. It's not about the ego. It's actually more about identifying as something like, hey, I don't identify as a specialist or just a single narrow-minded person because I don't have just one toolkit. I have many toolkits. And I don't know when I first started polymath, but I remember doing a really in-depth research paper or presentation on Leonardo da Vinci in 7th grade.
Yeah.
So that was pretty early on, I would say.
He's probably the OG polymath, right?
For the most part, yeah. And you'd be surprised, like, there's actually not enough information about female polymaths and people of polymaths from around the world. When we think of polymath, we think of the Italian Renaissance or maybe something along the lines of just Western culture. But there's a ton of Middle Eastern and Asian polymaths that are super fascinating as well. And I can't name any off the top of my head, but that's the problem. I can't name any off the top of my head. So I need to work on that as well.
So talk to me about PolyInnovator. Like, when did the idea for that come up, and what was the intention with you creating that site?
Yeah. So I've made multiple sites for it, renovated it over the years, and it originated from my original endeavor. So that original endeavor was called United Living Construct, which was meant to be a hub of innovation. The slogan I used for that was quite similar to the little elevator pitch that I mentioned earlier as a teenager, world unity through self-development. So you have the philosophy that builds up people individually, then as a community, and then eventually as a global society we're built up as well. And that was kind of the idea, starting from the micro and growing into the macro. And so over time, I realized, okay, I like content creation. I started blogging back in 2011, 2012, and eventually around 2016, 2017, I started podcasting for that. And then eventually I realized I wasn't good enough, and so I needed to improve in order to achieve that goal. And PolyInnovator came out of that new endeavor.
Curious, when you say you weren't good enough, like, how did you make that decision? Like, what's the determining factor when you say something like that?
I had felt that there needed to be a charismatic leader when it comes to this United Living construct. Whether that's me or someone else, it didn't really quite matter, but I obviously wanted to be that kind of leadership role because this is kind of how my personality is. I like being able to lead people and help people do things and teach them, do all that kinds of stuff. And I realized that I had a lot of knowledge I needed to learn, and there's a lot of knowledge I wanted to learn, like smart city development, for example. And I could have continued down the United Living Construct line and kept doing it, and I still have it around, but I thought, if I'm going to do this, there's probably a better way of going about it. You need some kind of personal presence. People need to know who you are. Why are you doing this kind of thing? And why am I talking about this right now? And so PolyInnovator became the foundation for all the future careers that I wanted to have and this kind of online reputation of sorts.
So for visitors to the site, there's a lot going on. And I don't know if you've gotten that feedback before. So can you walk people through your thought process for the content that's on there and how people can best navigate there so they don't feel like a sense of overwhelm? Because I get the sense that you have, like, there's so much information that you have in your head and so much that you want to share with the world and so many ideas that you have, and I feel like that's reflective on the site. But sometimes, to get new people into the space, you sort of have to create a roadmap or this "you are here" map and just say, if you're interested in this, go here. If you're interested in this, go here. So, and I don't know if you've gotten this feedback before, but I'm wondering, as people, as a result of this podcast, maybe they'll go back to the site and they just get there and they're just like, okay, where do I go and how do I decide what to consume next?
Well, let me ask you, when was the last time you saw the site?
I'm pulling it up now. Is it polyinnovator.space?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's completely different from when we first connected. I was on WordPress and then I went to Ghost because it's a much simpler service. And you can go on there now and it should be a lot simpler. There's still a lot going on for the most part, but I think that when people go on, they might seem overwhelmed, but people are smart. I don't underestimate someone's intelligence when they come on. And so if they don't necessarily get it right away, there's obviously a chance they might leave, but it might also indulge their curiosity. And I tried to also simplify it too, because saying there's a lot going on in the first page is not worth it. I might as well lead them to another page and kind of have a journey across the site. And so the main thing is my only content is just what I call my main series, is video, written, and audio. And so I just break it up into those 3 different chunks.
And what's top of mind for you? There's a lot of ideas that you're working on and a lot of ideas that you have tried and, you're maybe not as interested. So maybe even just thinking about this year, like what's top of mind? What are some projects? What are you working on that has you excited?
Yeah, so the site itself is something I've been working on for the past couple months because I actually had a couple technical issues that I had to get around, and I finally did, and I'm super excited about it because I was able to. This site just has a more minimalist vibe. That's the whole point of Ghost itself, and so I was really excited to get that out because the way that it categorizes posts versus WordPress and some other sites, it's much more simple. It's just tags. There's no categories and tags, it's just tags, allowing for a cool new way I can approach my series. And so I have this idea for a consistency layer of my content. I want to be able to create content on a regular basis that people can expect, at least in some shape or form. And I already have been doing that from various different series, but I wanted to make it more pronounced this year. And then beyond that, to create courses and books and expand.
Is there a consistency with the type of person that comes to you for either information or for help or to start working with you?
When it comes to the persona, so to speak, I would identify not a particular one person, but for example, when I have my show, when I find people to interview, the thing I look for is if they're multidisciplinary. So if they have a main specialty and they're a specialist, even a hyper specialist, they're bound to have some sort of hobby. Maybe they're a podcaster like us, or actually, I don't call it a podcast, I call it a PolyCast, which I'll explain later too. But it's interesting because there's always something else that someone else is doing.
So switching gears to the PolyCast, do you remember what you were listening to at the time? Were you consuming podcasts, or where did the idea to add the PolyCast to your content marketing plan? When did that start?
So it evolved from the ULC podcast that I mentioned earlier, and I just kind of took it from there and kind of continued it and realized that I was translating from the ULC to PolyInnovator, same kind of topics, just a different way of expressing. And it was interesting because I originally had these 3 different content silos. You had podcasting, you had written blog posts, you had videos, and I was trying to achieve all 3 of them at once by doing them 3 separate things. But as you know too, you could take this, if you were recording video, you could have it on YouTube, then you can have the audio on all these different platforms, transcribe it, you have 3 different content types there. And so I try to take it in a more strategic and content repurposing in mind. So when it came to the PolyCast, I had my regular series that I had, or a couple of this regular podcasts that I made. It's like, okay, this is great, but not really what I'm wanting per se. And then I took the Omni content, and the last step of that is chopping out the audio and putting that on the PolyCast. Great, I have 2 different sources there. Well, at the beginning of summer last year, we're all stuck at home. I wanted to get my habit still going. And so I created a fireside blog and a fireside micro PolyCast, fireside being that personal kind of feeling to it. And these are just short form pieces that I wanted to do it daily kind of thing. And eventually I also started doing interviews. So I had 4 different kind of series for the audio. I know that seems confusing, so tell me how I can explain it better too.
Yeah, just maybe if you break out the thought process of like how you think about creating the content, and also when you have a subject matter, like what are you deciding? Like this could be on the podcast, this could be the written form, this could be the fireside. I'm interested in hearing like how you unpack like your content or your IP, and then how you decide how you're going to repurpose it.
Mm-hmm. So I don't repurpose everything for the most part. Like the fireside stuff is so small that I felt like it probably wouldn't be as prudent. The way I could repurpose it is doing more compilations. So I can make a blog post saying, here's the top 10 fireside micro polycasts that I made or something like that. But for the most part, I do those because I had ideas I wanted to share. Like you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ideas going around. Sometimes I just need a small outlet. I don't need to make a long form blog post or video or even do an interview on it. I just need to get the idea out there. Like one day I was really obsessed with this idea of the future of social media, and just getting that idea out there was what I was trying to do. And so the fireside, the micro polycast is something I'll do on a whim. I do have a list of ideas I can pull back on if I need to. And in the regular polycast, I just do when there's like a finale or something special event. And the Omni content is what I actually been wanting to do regularly, but I've been failing to. The only thing that I've done relatively regularly is the interviews, and that's because I had people relying on me to get those out.
How did you want, or how were you thinking about the content for the Polymath PolyCast now? Like, did you know initially you were going to be having a mix of solo and interviews, or that you already had in mind people that you wanted to have on the show?
That's just a super interesting question because I always wanted to do interviews. I got to see like Lewis Howes or Gary Vee talking to people. I'm like, I want to do that. There's a lot of cool people. Like I could talk to you and like have a good conversation. It's like, how do I go about doing that? And so I came across my podcast host, podcast.co, and then eventually they made a social network called Matchmaker.fm, which allows you to match with people.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things where it was pretty easy to talking to people that way. And so I just got started. And that's why I actually stopped doing the Omni content and focused mainly on that for the rest of the year last year. And I have done 83 interviews since May now. So that's, yeah.
And so, and you said everyone is ideally would fall into the polymath category or multidisciplinary in terms of like who they are.
I would say the latter. In fact, one of my main endeavors right now is trying to get this idea of a multidisciplinary spectrum out there. I'm actually going to do a talk about it here soon. That's what I was working on before talking to you today. I was working on the slides for that. And so it's interesting how there's a lot of terms people could use. Jack of all trades, specialist, generalist, polymath, renaissance man, dilettante, whatever you particularly want. And sometimes people identify as one. And like especially multipotentialite too. People really like that one for some reason. And it's the potential to do many different things. So I was like, okay, that's exciting. Yeah, and so I wanted to make an easy way for people to kind of be inclusive in that.
And where do you find these people?
It's interesting because a lot of them have come from Matchmaker, but it's easy too because you just look up Polymath and multipotentialite, and there's very few people who are still identifying as those terms. I literally actually went on Twitter and searched Polymath, went to the people tab, and there was 11,000 people on there, and I went through to the very bottom. I just went through the whole thing.
And do you have a system for how you do outreach, how you track, how you get people on the show, and how you determine like what you want to cover? How much research do you do? I'm interested in all that. Yeah.
I go ham on all of that, as they say. It's just interesting because I want to know what your online presence is like. And so I'll look at your multiple profiles, especially if it's on Matchmaker. Yet a lot of people have profiles on there. I can just jump right away. But sometimes I'll just do a Google search, see what comes up. If someone doesn't come up with very much, that may impact my decision when it comes to having them on. But I have had people with very little online presence be amazing guests. So I don't let it to be a determining factor per se. And it's interesting too when I actually do my research phase. Like once you sign up, that's when you're locked in, essentially. That's when I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to start doing my research now at some point in between the sign up and the day of the interview. And so I'll do the research. Sometimes I watch their entire YouTube channel. If it's small enough, I'll go through their entire blog. Like I did that recently for a new creator that came on who had 30 videos, 30 blog posts, and I just went through all of them.
Are you going through it 2x? On the
videos? Yeah, definitely. That's the thing. I'm talking really fast right now. You can just imagine what my videos are like. There were some points today it was 3x. So
yeah, it's funny because I always use the analogy of like Neo in the Matrix when he's like,
I know kung fu.
Like he plugs in, and it's I think there's something to it, and I don't know if you've done any research or read anything about this, but sometimes I consume content quickly, some of that 2x, some of these videos, because I just want to absorb the content and I want it to go into my cellular memory somewhere. And I don't know if that's something that'll be helpful later. I can actually pull those out, but we're at the point where there's no way we're going to be able to consume all the content we want to consume in this world because it's just being created at crazy, crazy speed, and it's hard for us to keep up. So, especially you with so many hobbies and so many things to keep up, are you listening for anything specifically in your research for these guests, or are you just trying to get a big picture of like what they're working on?
There's a lot of macro in it. So when someone is multidisciplinary, there's a lot of a big picture going on, and understanding how that big picture works is usually underneath the pillars of that are going to be their main aspects of their focus. So what are they doing as a day job? What are they doing as a hobby? What are they doing on the side? And those are the pillars of what their macro becomes. But I do like to look for the micro things. There was one day I was scrolling through a guest's Instagram, and I went about halfway down his feed when I found who his hero was. And I was like, oh, that's cool. That's the only point, I think, in all of his content that I'll find that out. And that's a little micro detail that really adds up. And you try to find as many of those as I can.
Okay, so now you've done the research, you know who you're going to talk to, you know what you're going to talk about, you know a little bit of their backstory. Mm-hmm. So as you get ready for the day of the interview, what experience or how have you grown as an interviewer, as you get started? Because there's a different set of skills that you need when to have a conversation with someone, to keep them engaged, to keep the audience engaged and follow along.
For one, body language. So, I've learned to not cover my mouth like I am right now, because it's a subconscious thing. Like, okay, it looks like I don't want to talk, and so you might see it and I might need to change my thing, or looking away like this, which the audience can't see right now, but I'm looking away from the camera. This entire time, I've been looking at the camera, and so I'm sure Harry's probably getting a kick out of it right now too, because it's one of those things that you learn that when you're doing a video show, especially, people want to see eye contact, and if I just looked at the person on the screen, I'm looking away from the person watching, and so I'll do that. And one of the first things I made sure I did was become a better listener. And I know I'm a talker. And so the first thing I was like, you need to shut up and active listen to these people.
Well, that's an interesting one as well, because it's one of the things that new hosts seem to forget, or just it's not something that's taught. Like no one's teaching people how to be a good podcast host, but I think people that are public speakers, like they have a habit of just like owning the stage and just talking about their topic nonstop. And I think what's interesting for a podcast host and people who have edited audio can see like the WAV file. And I've had podcast friends and say, hey, check out who was dominating this conversation, and it's like host and guest, and you can see like the host is like a lot of activity,
Yeah.
and guest not so much activity, and you're like, okay, like I guess they didn't learn the lesson, and all they're doing is talking about themselves, and it is a learned skill, and so that's why I'm curious, like if it's something in the beginning you're saying you weren't aware of, but then over time you felt that the quality of your conversations improved.
So one thing I just want to touch on that is that I've been on probably like 40 different shows at this point, and it is interesting to think about how well a lot of the hosts have been. Like this one is already being really good. You're asking questions, even turning out the mic to make sure that there is not as much noise going on, the canceling, that kind of thing. And so it's interesting that I was on a show recently, and I won't say any names, something like that, but this host was just spending most of the time talking about their own history. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like I'm interested in hear about yours too, but like you are here to interview me. Like, I mean, okay, cool. Like either way, but it was just interesting because it was a pretty one-sided conversation, and I'm okay with that. Like I understand it's one of those things. Some people just want an outlet, and they want someone on there to be a soundboard, and that's cool. I don't want to be that kind of person, and I know that's not great for a podcast host, but to each their own, so to speak, I guess. And there are some things I have learned that got better too, which we'll touch on later, I guess.
Yeah, no, feel free to share them now. I mean, that's we definitely want to dive deep.
Well, I just didn't want to interrupt your particular response if you had one. Because, see, that's the thing I'm thinking about, too, is that I really like to go meta on my show. And when you told me at the beginning, too, that we're just going to go with the flow, I'm like, okay, cool, this is going to be a fun show, because I don't have to hold back in some cases. Because I've been on some shows where they were like 30 minutes long, and I had to hold back a lot of it. And like by the time we get to the end of it, I'm like, I'm just getting started, let's go. Like,
yeah. One
of the things I've learned is the structure of the show. And so I started out knowing, like, okay, I need an intro, I need an outro, like, let's get a call to action, let's make sure that there's, like, I'll check to make sure people have enough time for the show too, especially since I take the Joe Rogan approach where we'll just go as long as the guest feels right.
Yeah.
And so I started tweaking how I did the intro, making it shorter. I want to mention PolyInnovator since the PolyCast is underneath that, but I don't want it to make it the main thing, get people confused, because there is a lot of polys when I speak. Polymath PolyCast, PolyInnovator. I used to call it the Poly blog before I changed it to the Omni blog, because just having a pure blog I think is boring nowadays. And so just making a short intro, giving a good quick synopsis of what the person is about. So I'll try to do like all their credentials and awesome traits about them, what they're interested in. And then I'll do an icebreaker, which is, can you share something about yourself that no one knows about you? And I stole that from John Lee DeMoss, I think. And it's interesting because that's a hard question for people to answer sometimes. And once they get through that one, everything else afterwards becomes easy.
Yeah. And can you share something about you that a lot of people don't know about?
I knew you were going to do that. I was like, I almost hesitated to share that with you because I knew you were going to do it. So I'm thinking, I am a pretty open book. One thing I don't talk about much, and I've only really talked about it in the manifesto, so to speak, that I made a while back, is that my ideal goal is to help the world become a type 1 civilization on the Kardashev scale. That's one reason why I created the ULC and PolyInnovator, is that down the line, I'm wanting to help develop smart cities in my former adult life, I guess you could say, foremost or whatever the term would be, middle life. And then eventually those smart cities will help the world become more of a type 1.
On what scale? What was the scale that you mentioned?
Kardashev scale.
Okay. Can you explain that for the benefit of the listener that might not know?
Yeah, so it is a scale. I don't remember what the guy first name was, but his last name is obviously Kardashev. That's what they named it after. And it's essentially just a scale of humanity, or what kind of civilization can achieve. So the type 1 is someone who has full power over their planet. So they can help control weather systems. They have energy supply met, in fact, probably often surplus. And so we're probably around 0.75 is what the last calculation was at. And so we're not quite there yet. We are still using fossil fuels, which are non-renewable. And so switching over to renewables is a great proponent of that. But if you go past that, a type 2 civilization is a civilization that can traverse their entire solar system. So there's a show called The Expanse where they go all the way out to the outer rim. That is a type 2 civilization. They're able to travel between planets pretty well, pretty easily, move resources from the asteroid belt to the inner planets, whatever it may be. And then a type 3 is one on a galaxy level. And type 4, I think, is like a universe level, which is probably quite similar to omnipotent and kind of God level in that
Yeah,
point.
yeah. Where can listeners, and myself included, after this conversation, go to learn more about this? Because it touches upon a bunch of different things, and it's stuff that interests me. I'm fascinated by this idea of interdimensionary travel, and fascinated. I'm also very spiritual, and you'll see like the Pleiades galaxy behind me. So I'm fascinated. I love movies about space. I loved Interstellar, Christopher Nolan's movie. I don't know if you saw Tenet. Just any like movies that hurt my head, like when I'm watching them, trying to figure out like what just happened here, because they're playing with like, you know, quantum physics topics in a way that's interesting, and to even be able to build a story around that. So I'm speaking for myself, and I'm interested in going further down that rabbit hole. So what's the best source of information that you found to go to learn more about that?
There's 2 YouTube channels. I actually almost didn't have an answer for you because there's not much content around it besides maybe video games for the most point. But there's a channel, his name is Isaac Arthur. He creates a lot of really awesome content around that. There's another one, Let Me Know, and I don't know how to spell that. It starts with like Lemino, I think. But 2 different channels, so that might be a good point to start.
And you can we can follow up this conversation. You can share it with me, and I'll make sure it's all in the show notes by the time this episode gets published. How do you think about these topics in a way that keeps you from going down rabbit holes? Because that's a challenge that I have sometimes when I see these things and I read about these things. I get so fascinated by the topic. I love time travel movies as well, and just like, you know, like, because there's so many things that are pushing the boundaries of what we know to be true, what we think to be true, and like where reality lies. And if you go down the quantum physics rabbit holes and objects at a distance, and like, you know, it gets pretty crazy. So I'm wondering if that happens to you, and how you manage to control what you're consuming, and, you know, how deep you're going, especially being a polymath.
Well, growing up as a teenager, I was watching videos on astrophysics for fun. So I think that kind of explains some mindset behind it. And I would honestly say I've often gotten a lot of existential crises, and it's hard to deal with those, especially when they hit you really hard. So I don't have any particular ways of getting out of them besides just letting time happen, and over time just kind of processing it as much as possible. Like, our brains can't handle those big numbers when it comes to billions or trillions or like everything. And so it is interesting the fact that when you have something big, it takes time to process, and kind of think of yourself like a computer and giving it time for that CPU to just process through it.
Yeah.
Or meditation helps too.
Can you talk, or do you feel comfortable talking about a recent existential crisis?
I mean, I don't know if I would count it as a crisis, but I've been having some very vivid dreams the past few months. Like, there was one point I had dinner with Samuel L. Jackson 3 times, like 3 different dreams over the course of a month, so to speak. And then just recently, I had a dream, a very super vivid dream, that I was in Bhutan. Of all countries in the world that I don't even think about on a regular basis, I was in Bhutan, on a specific city with a specific style. I don't know what the city was, but because it was just in my head. And then literally a day later, I saw a couple videos on Bhutan on TikTok. And it's just one of those things that have these weird serendipity moments, or coincidence, so to speak. So I've been having a lot of those lately, and that's kind of the best I can probably share at the moment.
It's almost that reticular... What's the reticular formation, or when you see something that you've been thinking about, like, you know, the Volkswagen Bug is the common example. Like, you buy one and all of a sudden you see it on the road.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's things that you've been thinking of, because by nature of the conversations you're having on the PolyCast, you're probably covering a wide range of topics on the show.
For sure, quantum physics to city civil engineering, so to speak, and having different concepts from marketing to podcasting to all kinds of different things. So yeah, you're totally on point.
Have you heard of Neom, Neom.com?
No, I mean, maybe.
There was a big Twitter campaign called Hold the Line, and it was just fascinating because you can tell they put a lot of money. It's a sustainable community being built from the ground up with no cars. I think it's no roads, and all very connected to nature. They're building it in Saudi Arabia, where they can, you know, have the land to build this sort of thing. So it feels like it's something that'd be right up your alley.
For sure.
To go down. So.
Well, and that's the thing. Like, one of the reasons why I created PolyInnovator is because I couldn't find a pathway to find cities like that or to build them. Because back at that point, there was a lot less going on. There was one in China, one, I think Dubai was the main one then, and then a couple that happened in the US, like the Venus Project or Disney's Epcot, like the original Epcot idea, which was a smart city. And so it's interesting how there was very little going on. There was no degrees in smart city development, and now there's one or two, the master's level, but again, I don't have a bachelor, so I can't pursue that. I decided, screw it, I'm going to make my own degree because I can't seem to find it. And that's what started PolyInnovator as well. So I used that as a documentation process over my own do-it-yourself education.
That's fascinating. So when you're having these conversations with these guests, are you learning a lot? And how are you processing the information that you're learning? Because sometimes for me, like I have these fascinating conversations, and I definitely put this in one of those categories where I feel like now I have homework as a result of this conversation with my guest, that I gotta not only have to continue to do what I do for my business, but also I have to have a way to process it. And we were chatting before that pre-chat about some of the tools we use, like Notion, to keep track of all of all this stuff. So I'm wondering, as the source of information comes out to you, I call this building. Tiago Forte, he's building a second brain, and I've implemented his para system as well, which is how he organizes information. So that's been helpful for me, just to have like systems in place. Like if I see an article, immediately goes to Instapaper, like that, and I move it offside. Like I have those systems for all that, and I'm wondering what the types of systems that you've built to be able to consume and process this information and decide when to dig deeper.
I hope we have enough time to explain all this. So it's interesting because first and foremost, I love learning, and since I couldn't find a college that I wanted to go to, I pursued my own education. But this was actually after I pursued my own self-development. I want to go into those, but I think first the systems are probably more interesting. I actually foregoed the para method because it wasn't very useful with Notion. The templates for it weren't very powerful. And alternatively, there is get things done mentality, philosophy. There's also Zettelkasten, which is where Tiago Forte first got his idea from. And then there's also August Bradley's Pipes, Pillars, and Vaults. And it's kind of a different way of approaching it, built on Notion itself. And personally, I was like, you know what? I love all of these, even the Paramethod and Second Brain, but I want to make something myself. And before I even came across those, I did build my own omni-content builder. Essentially, I made a giant database to help organize it all with templates in there. And I think templates on Notion are a very underutilized feature, because if you can make a template and apply it to multiple different episodes, like for example, the interviews, I'll have a template. Okay, these are what I mentioned before the show. Like, hey, everything's relaxed. You need to go drink a water. Here we go. Do you have any questions? Stuff like that. And then you have the section for the Calendly. So people put in their information in Calendly. I put that in there, use that for questions too. Then I have my intro, then I have the questions, then I have the email, the outro, and then the timestamps and links and all that stuff. And so I have that built out every time I have a new guest on there. And that's one way I can really systematize that. And same thing goes for my modular degree, which is that education endeavor I mentioned. And then the omni-content or whatever aspect, like personal life too, expense tracking on Google Sheets is so boring, but on Notion it actually seems kind of fun.
Yeah. What else system-wise has been helpful for you?
So it's interesting because I mentioned earlier how when I try to find guests on Twitter, I went to the very end. And I do that a lot, it seems. So, for example, when I had WordPress, I wanted to know what kind of plugins were on the platform. And I kept going through searching for different keywords, but it wasn't enough. And there's 11,000 listings on WordPress. I was like, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to go through every single one to see if it works for my site. And I found some cool stuff that way. Yumi. So UHMI is a tool that you can make microtransactions for if you have a downloadable PDF, for example. Okay. Super cool tool. Wouldn't have found it any other way, essentially. And so I found the same strategy to work with project management, task management, email marketing, social media marketing tools. All four of those, I went through most, if not all, that are online to try to see what one would work.
It's not an approach I think most people would take, probably 99% of
it's
people.
The polymathic approach.
And so are these all self-taught systems, approaches, or is this something that you would pick up a bit here, a bit there, and then start to think about how you sort of, grok a system that fits your style and the way you think?
I would say a bit of both. So, like, the modular degree came about purely from what my needs were. Then I realized, oh, I'm being selfish here. It's not just about me. There's other people who can use the same system. There was either people before me who did something similar, like Laurie Picard's No Pay MBA or Scott Young's MIT Challenge. They did something similar already, but they were very niche. They were very focused on business or computer science. I wanted to create a template or a system that other people can use for anything. The skill tree based kind of learning aspect that I was coming up with. And so it's interesting how I made that up. But when it came to like this Notion operating system, as we could call it, I really tried to incorporate everything from everyone in some way, shape, or form. I'm still working on it. I'm not fully done with it yet, but I think that I've already started a lot farther than most.
And do you have those are those templated, and are those available?
Yeah. So I don't know about the templates because sometimes they are private, so you have to go through and find those on the particular YouTubers' channels, but I actually made a playlist of some of the best videos when it comes to this, and I'll send it to you.
Okay. What are you currently working on machine-wise? Because I'm curious, when someone like you needs to process a lot of information, I'm just out of curiosity, Mac, Windows, or...
So I loathe Apple, and so I have Windows, but I have 3 screens here, so that's what I was trying to show you there.
Yeah. Well, that's funny because how do you make a decision like that? Because I think a lot of people are just by default feel that folks that are in tech are into Apple, and I'm wondering what your thought process there was.
Okay. People who are in like some soft techs when it comes to like maybe programming or like design, they might go to Mac, but most of the actual tech nerds, like the IT nerds, they all go to Linux. Mm-hmm. So let's make that distinction there. Like the real nerds go to Linux. Even I've looked at Linux, and I don't necessarily want to go to Linux per se because I like gaming, which is why I'm on Windows. Okay. So yeah, that's one reason. Like I think that if I didn't have what's the anti-affinity? Like an anti-affinity towards Apple, I would probably love their system because it's so interconnected. But I don't know. I just don't like how their UI and their systems work.
Yeah, aversion. That would be
aversion. There we go. Thank you. I guess we'll keep that in there for people to laugh at.
Yeah. No, it's also interesting because there's no perfect way to do a show. And when you have a podcast that speaks to podcasters, I tend to leave like all the like missteps. And sometimes I've had trouble like pronouncing guests' names, and I leave it in there because I want people to listen who are podcasting, who are trying to podcast or interested in podcasting, to know like there's no perfection. And I think COVID has highlighted that as well. We're not all sitting in NPR studios with our quality mics. And I think it's the reality, and it's what makes podcasting so exciting and achievable for a lot of people, who just may think it's not for them. I think as long as you like talking, I think podcasting is a good fit for you.
Just be real.
Yes. Are there certain guests that come to mind that you've spoken to recently, that you've really been fascinated, enjoyed their conversations, and why?
One that I bring up, because I remember trying to get her on the show for a long time. I found her via TikTok, and she's a quantum computing content creator. And I thought, like, that is so fantastic. And honestly, I probably like bored her to death afterwards because I just like was so like, oh my God, you're awesome. Because it's just one of those things that's so fascinating when it comes to not only the subject matter, but then the fact that she's a content creator on top of that too. She would be someone that I would consider like a hyper specialist, or at the very least a deep specialist. But when you look at what she's doing and the other things she's done in the past, she's a very multidisciplinary person, which is why I thought she'd be a good fit for the show. And ironically, I was kind of mad at myself. By the end of the call, we talked so much about her content creation and life beforehand. We didn't even touch on quantum physics very much. And I was like, that sucks. I want to have her back on. But I thought that was a good example of just like sometimes you go on rabbit holes, like you were saying earlier.
Anyone else come to mind? Because you've had you're over, what's the total count
83
now? 83, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many. Like I could list every single one and be fascinated by each of them. There was a guy named Matt Lucas who I had on relatively recently who helped teach basically martial arts and stunts and stretching and yoga, all kinds of different things to various actors in different ways. He's worked on different sets, different movies, and worked on like stunts, stunt coordinating, that kind of thing. And so, do you know the show Into the Badlands?
Yes, I've seen it. Yeah, I know about it, but I think I maybe watched a couple of episodes. Yeah,
you know the main character there?
Not by name, but
the face.
Know the actor. Yeah.
Yeah. So Matt Lucas is his main trainer. And so it was very interesting how his philosophy when it comes down to like just being able to move. So some of the simplest things of like moving the neck, moving the shoulders, influence the most advanced stunts and most advanced martial arts. And he has a philosophy about pretty much everything's martial arts. You can almost distill everything down to martial arts. Even podcasting is an art on its own too.
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting philosophy that way.
How do you continuously push yourself to be a better host?
I think not just host, but content creator in general, because there's some days where I just don't want to get up. I don't want to get out of bed. I literally wrote a post the other night that I honestly felt like I was being kind of self-pitying, but I also wanted to get it out there because I have this new daily habit on my, what I call the Fireside Codex, which is that new Fireside blog, new version of that I made last year, where I just wanted to get writing every day. And so I think that is a good example of, I don't care about quality. I don't care about SEO optimization per se. Like I'll make a meta description because I'm a writer at heart. I know how to do that pretty quickly, but like, I'm not making it for perfection. I'm making it just so I have a habit of making around 1,000 words a day, so that way I can start working on more advanced writing pieces in the future. And I think that's a good way for any kind of content. It's just getting practice. Roberto Blake, Gary Vee, all these great content creators say, if you want to be a better YouTuber or better podcaster, do 100. Just get 100 out there, and eventually you're just going to get better over the process.
What communities are there out there for polymaths? For where do you go to get stimulated, to get energized, to learn? I have a pretty good idea that there's some out there that the listener would not be aware of where you like to hang out.
So there's a lot that I didn't know about, and one of the thought leaders that I'll shout out, and Dr. Angela Catalesa, she created Polymath Place, which is meant to be kind of a place for people to come together. And I noticed that there was a lot of little tribes like that, and hers was one of the biggest, and I really respect her work. I had her on the show too, and she's another guest that I would give a shout out to. This is just interesting, the way that she approached her dissertation. And so it's one of the things where I found all these different pockets, and all these different groups have their own kind of theme of sorts, because being a polymath individually is going to have a lot of different topics. Having a group of polymaths means there's an insurmountable amount of topics. Exponential, yeah. And so it's one of those things where each pocket is going to be significantly different between the other ones. I wanted to create an umbrella pocket, so one that could host all these other pockets. That way, if Facebook decides they don't want Facebook groups anymore, they have a place to go to. And so like, I have a website people can check out, poly.tribe.so, which is the community that I'm building for that same reason. It's a good question.
What's your expectation with that site?
That's interesting because it has evolved. At first, I just wanted to have a place for my guests who I knew were multidisciplinary to come in, then eventually open it up to other people. But I also didn't want it to be too exclusive, because I want my whole philosophy is to be more inclusive. One of the reasons why I have my show is so I can exemplify the multidisciplinary traits of my guests. Oftentimes, they didn't even hear the word polymath until the day of or day before. Oftentimes, they may not even identify as that, even after the interview. But I see them as that, and I want to exemplify how common being multidisciplinary really is. And so I thought that with this particular group, we could help each other out, instill new ideas. There was the same idea behind the United Living Construct, to make a hub of innovation, a hub of innovators to come together.
Do you have a long-term vision? Where are you going? I mean, the way your mind is constantly moving, like people can tell by the by the excitement you have on this episode, and the range of topics that we've covered. And if anyone's taking notes, they're probably on page 5 or 6 by now. So I'm wondering how do you process all the information, not only that you've already learned, but that I get the sense that you're going to be a lifelong learner, right? And you want to get better at some of the things as well. Because I think the nature of a polymath, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is not only to know a thing, but also to, at some point, develop improvements in it and maybe even a mastery in it.
No, you're totally on point. And so it's interesting too, because it's the intersection of those areas that's the real key, I think. And so the more you learn in a particular skill set or area of knowledge, the more you can learn in another area. And there's this idea of transferable knowledge or transferable skills or trans-contextual thinking. Those are multiple terms that people can look up and have a whole rabbit hole on their own. And being able to bridge connections between different areas, like, hey, I want to build a house. I also want to build a city. What's the similarities between those two things? And so how can you really build a house more effectively when you think about it from a city scale? How can you build a city better when you know how the houses are being built and that kind of thing?
And so the origin of the question is,
where are you
going with this? Like, do you think about 5 years? Do you think about 10 years? Do you think about vision? How do you feel about vision statements? As an entrepreneur, there's a lot of talk about mission and vision. Do these terms resonate with you? Mm-hmm. Do they give you a North Star, or how do they help you in terms of like figuring out where you want to go?
So, essentially speaking, I did mention the whole manifesto before, and that's kind of one of the ways that I wanted to just get it out there. Mm-hmm. But essentially speaking, I have thought about 5 years. I have thought about 10 years. I wanted to be where I'm at like 5 years ago. And so it's one of those things that my particular mindset on it doesn't really matter. It's just a matter of keep going, and eventually I'll get there. Because I don't care if I'm 80 and I'll finally get there. Mm-hmm. But I'd like it to be when I'm 50 or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
What are some of the things that come to mind when you do think big picture?
So smart city development, for sure. That's one thing I was mentioning earlier, just getting out there and starting to really work on these cities. And I think that there needs to be a cohesive hub for all of them. And that's what the ULC was meant to be, is like this cohesive hub between all these different smart cities, like a node of sorts. And so I thought that there needed to be something like that, and no one else is truly working on it. I guess you mentioned NEOM, and I'm going to be looking back into that because I heard them before, but I totally forgot about it. So thank you for bringing that back up. But it's interesting how, for me, I'm not good enough yet, and I still don't think I am, and that's a good thing. That's not a diss on myself. It's just a realization that there's a lot more to learn, and that I shouldn't slow down, and that I shouldn't. Hustling too hard is okay as long as you know how to rest and take care of yourself. And I've been trying to do that. Like, I took a write-off period, or it's REIT, write-off, last year at the end of the year, because I told myself I was going to do a PolyCast interview every day, or a PolyCast every day, because I was so behind on releasing interviews. It wasn't that I was just going too slow, so doing once a week, and it wasn't fast enough. I was recording them way faster than I was sending them out. So I told him I was going to do one every day. And I was going to do it all the way up to the end of the year, but after, basically right before Christmas, I just started burning out. I could tell like I was going to get to that point. And so I took a break. And so I understand that sometimes you need to slow down, sometimes you need to speed back up. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, what's a write-off?
So I only heard about the term recently, so I don't have the greatest definition. But essentially, there's certain tell signs of what you were doing is going to lead to some kind of burnout. And I have burned out in the past. And so I really wanted to avoid that because I have a lot I need to get done in these next coming months. And so I want to make sure that if I don't take care of myself, then I'm not going to be able to do it. I want to make sure I get that stuff done. So I just decided, okay, if I want to sleep in, I'll sleep in. If I want to play video games instead of working on stuff, I'll let myself do that. I'll try to not do it for too long because you don't want to become a dilettante or not do enough, basically. But allowing yourself to take that break. There's actually a philosophy, I don't remember the guy's name, but one of my guests, Santi Younger, brought it up to me, where this guy, every 7 years, would take a year off and would just go take a sabbatical and travel around. Certainly your finances have to be in accordance to do that, but it's the same thing that people do nowadays. For every 6 months, they'll take a 2-week vacation kind of thing, but it's on a bigger scale.
Lots of follow-up questions. I get the sense that we could easily have a 3-hour podcast, and maybe
let's do it.
And maybe we can do that later at some point and just have it. We call it a turn the mic on episode, and just figure out which of the rabbit holes you want to chase. And because all these topics that you talk about, like for me, would be fascinating. So yeah, I'd love to follow up with you and just go deep and just figure it out, because like you said, there's people that are interested in a wide variety of topics. And myself, I'm like, I have so many interests, and sometimes I don't know which one to go down. And I just want to be conscious of the fact that there are people that like to process that. But it's also, you need systems. You need a way to sort of understand it all, because that fire hose of information can be overwhelming. It could fry your circuits, which is something probably you've been alluding to.
Information overload.
Yeah. And so having the ability to do a rest and a recharge and an understanding, like, how do I reset? Because you can't possibly be going at the pace you're going at without burning out.
I have a point I want to make real quick, is that these shows help me as an output. So I can't seem to create enough content to get the output out myself, which is why I systematize it. That's why I'm trying to do every day. My Omni content was meant to be a way to do 100 pieces of content a day. That's like how Gary Vee was talking about, let's do 100 pieces of content a day. If you're not doing as much as you could be. I was like, okay, cool. You're kind of being a little crazy with that, but I'm going to try it. And I made my own strategy for it. Yeah. That's another whole rabbit hole. But my point was, I wanted to do it every day. And I realized that doing these interviews are really great, even on my show, but especially when I'm on someone else's show talking, I'm able to get a lot out and start to reformat my ideas, and I can actually explain them differently and better over time with practice.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just because you're intelligent doesn't mean you're a good communicator. And I think some of the geniuses of the world just have had challenges communicating their ideas.
Yes, Nikola Tesla is a prime example right there.
I'm fascinated by Nikola Tesla. I think there's a lot happening in his life and a lot of things that he knew that he only shared a fraction of what he was capable of. And just if you just get a glimpse of him, anytime there's a book or a series or a documentary about him, I'm just immediately drawn for some reason to like learn more about him, because there's a lot I feel like that's mysterious about his life. And it's one of the few, sometimes you say people are ahead of their time. Like he's literally like one of those people that I think are just really, really ahead of
Da
his
Vinci
time.
was the same way, and I feel the exact same way like you're saying about Tesla. I was about him too. And it's funny because he wrote so much of his notebooks that if they were published, he would be known as an inventor, not a painter.
That's interesting. Well, a couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something that you've changed your mind about recently?
Oh, I had a good answer for this earlier, but I don't know what I would say. I guess I could change my mind around just how I approached the whole branding kind of thing, because I wanted to simplify it. I had 4 different platforms I was on: Medium, WordPress, Airtext, which is a blockchain writing tool. Let's see, like 2 different ones for WordPress, essentially. I had multiple different platforms that I consolidated all into the new Ghost ecosystem. And that's why I was really happy about it, because I was able to simplify different content types as simply just tags. And I think that was a good way of going about it, because now when people do get to my site, they may be overwhelmed, but they can find the trails much more easily. I even have tags right there on the homepage for someone to just randomly click on if they wanted to. And so that's something I changed my mind around, just how I wanted to approach it. Because I wanted to be omnichannel. That was my philosophy. And I decided to make it a little bit more simple, not as omnichannel, not as multi-channel, and just kind of keep it a little bit more condensed.
Okay. What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Misunderstood thing about myself, I would say, is that most people don't see that I have a big picture in mind. Like you were asking about vision, you're asking about 5-year plans. And honestly, I have probably 80-year plans if I really think about it. And it's just one of those things where I created PolyInnovator because I had so many things I wanted to do in life, so many phases that I wanted to do. Create music, be a gaming creator. My whole past, which we didn't even touch on so much as a professional, is that I do fitness instruction, aquatic based mainly, like water aerobics and swim lessons, and also personal training. So one of my next phases for PolyInnovator is going to be talking about all the stuff I knew from that. And it's just interesting how, because that is a phase-based system, it's probably confusing people more now when it comes to talking about it. But right now, it's just a matter of modular education and polymathy. That's what I'm talking about at the moment for the most part. And so most people don't see the get that I'm thinking 10 years ahead, always.
Who's inspiring you right now?
Gary Vee was a big inspiration back in 2017, 2018. But in the past couple of years, Ali Abdaal was he's a cool YouTuber, and he was inspiring me for a while there. He's actually one of the main reasons why I switched to Ghost. Let's see. And just talking to people like you, too. I think that's having this different conversations with smart people and being able to really have an intellectual discussion. That's what really inspires me.
Well, this was as wide-ranging as I thought it might be, Dustin, so thank you so much for taking the time. Like I said, it feels like this is one of those conversations that can go in a bunch of different threads. So I think we're going to have a follow-up, with you and then keep talking. I've got a couple of rabbit holes already now because of the links, just from the links you shared. But I was just excited to get a peek inside your brain.
I'm always happy to come back.
Yeah, and I'm glad you were able to share, because I think there's a lot for people to process, but I think it's also inspiring for people to understand when you have a passion about something, there's no limits, or that you shouldn't put limits on yourself in terms of like what you're capable of learning if you put the systems in place and you do the work, because I think that's what a lot of people are afraid to do the work. So I appreciate you sharing your story and sharing your systems and sharing your ideas.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks to Dustin for coming on the show. Like I said at the beginning, there was a lot to process there, and I found myself going back through my notes on this one, as there was a lot to learn from Dustin and how he thinks about problems, which I find fascinating. Full show notes available at podcastjunkies.com/251. Intro and outro music composed by Cedar and Soil. Don't forget to check out our sponsors, Focusrite, their fantastic line of gear, specifically the Scarlett 2i2 Pro, at podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite. Podcast production and marketing provided by Fullcast. Sign up for a free podcast brainstorm at fullcast.co/chat15. Next week, I get to have a friend on the show again, Shelby Stanger, host of Wild Ideas Worth Living, a podcast that was launched by our production company, picked up by REI, and Shelby has the entire story to share with us. She's also the host of a new show called Vitamin Joy. If you made it this far, you're no doubt looking for this week's retention hashtag. Let's go with PolyDustin and tag me at podcast_junkies and Dustin at PolyInnovator, PolyInnovator. Thanks for all you do to support the show. I'll talk to you later this week as we have another episode coming out at the end of this week. Much love for you all.